Nobody looks heroic when they're hungry, Elias Carter used to say, but the girl standing in the rain outside his bakery looked like she had been surviving on pride alone. Acid rain hissed against the neon awnings of Dock District 12, turning the narrow alleyways into rivers of oily silver light, while freight drones groaned overhead like tired mechanical whales. The station's heating grid had failed again sometime before dawn, and cold vapor drifted through the lower streets hard enough to sting exposed skin. Most businesses along Harbor Row had already shut their security shutters for the night, their signs flickering weakly behind reinforced glass, but Elias's bakery still glowed warm against the darkness. The old man at the repair stall across the street liked to joke that the smell of fresh bread from Carter's oven could probably stop a riot. Tonight, though, even the smell seemed tired. Elias wiped flour from his rough hands onto a faded gray apron while trays of rye loaves cooled behind the counter. The little shop hummed softly with heat from the brick oven, casting amber light across cracked tile floors and shelves lined with cheap soup tins for dock workers too broke to afford restaurant food. He was reaching to switch off the front sign when movement outside caught his eye. A figure stood beneath the flickering blue transit lamp across the street. Small, thin, completely still. At first he thought it was another scavenger kid hoping for scraps, but then the figure stepped forward into the rain light, and Elias realized she wasn't human. Her skin carried a pale blue tint beneath the station glow, almost gray from exhaustion, and strands of silver hair clung wetly to her face. Her clothes looked military once, maybe medical corps from the cut of the coat, but now the fabric hung loose around her frame like it belonged to someone healthier. She stared through the bakery window with an expression Elias had seen too many times before on starving miners and refugees arriving from the outer colonies. Not desperation. Worse, calculation. The kind people used when they were deciding whether their dignity was worth less than survival. She hesitated before stepping inside. A soft chime rang above the door, and warm air wrapped around her immediately. Elias noticed the way her shoulders almost collapsed from the sudden heat. Water dripped from the edge of her sleeves onto the floor. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The station announcer crackled faintly somewhere outside, listing delayed cargo arrivals in 6 languages, while the bakery oven ticked softly behind the counter. Up close, the girl looked younger than he expected. Maybe early 20s by human standards. Her eyes were violet, dull with exhaustion, but still sharp enough to hold onto pride. Elias had seen soldiers with that same look after the war ended. "Kitchen's closing," he said gently, though his voice lacked any real firmness. "But I've still got bread left." The girl swallowed once before reaching slowly into her coat pocket. Not begging, not pleading. Her trembling fingers placed a small silver medal onto the countertop between them. The metal was scratched and worn smooth around the edges, attached to a faded blue ribbon darkened by rainwater. Elias stared at it longer than he meant to. Military issue. Alien Medical Division. Old War design. "It's real silver," the girl said quietly, her translator struggling slightly with human consonants. "Enough for 1 loaf." Elias looked from the metal to her face. She wouldn't meet his eyes now. Somewhere deep in the station, thunder rolled through the support beams like distant artillery. He noticed then how carefully she kept her hands folded together, hiding the shaking. Not fear. Hunger. Real hunger. The kind that hollowed people from the inside out. Elias exhaled slowly and pushed the metal back across the counter toward her. "Keep it," he said. The girl blinked, confused. "I can pay." "I didn't say you couldn't." He grabbed the warmest loaf from the rack behind him, the crust still crackling softly from the oven. Then he reached for a bowl beneath the counter and filled it with potato soup left from the dinner rush. Steam curled upward between them. "Sit down before you pass out," he muttered. For the first time since entering the bakery, the alien girl looked genuinely startled. Not by the food, by the kindness. The girl sat at the far end of the counter like she was afraid the warmth might suddenly disappear if she moved too much. Steam drifted from the bowl between her trembling hands, while rainwater slowly dried from her silver hair under the glow of the bakery lights. Elias pretended to organize trays behind the counter, but his eyes kept drifting back toward her every few seconds. She ate carefully, too carefully, tiny bites, long pauses, the way people did after going too many days without real food. Outside, Dock District 12 groaned beneath another surge of freight traffic. Massive cargo clamps rattled somewhere above the station's ceiling, and the floor vibrated softly under the weight of incoming or shipments from the outer colonies. None of it seemed to reach inside the bakery. The little shop existed in its own pocket of warmth now, filled with the smell of yeast, cinnamon, and simmering broth. The girl finally looked up after finishing half the soup. "You should have taken the medal," she said quietly. Elias shrugged while wiping flour from the steel countertop. "And you should have eaten 3 days ago." Her expression tightened slightly at that. Not offended. Exposed. 2 days, she corrected softly. "I still had water yesterday." Elias stopped moving for a second. Then he reached behind the counter and tore another thick slice from the loaf. He slid it toward her without saying anything. She stared at it before speaking again. "Most humans here would not feed me. Most humans here barely feed themselves." That earned the faintest reaction from her. Not quite a smile. More like surprise at hearing humor survive in a place like this. The station lights flickered overhead for half a second before stabilizing again. Power shortages. Normal for the lower districts. The girl glanced toward the windows automatically, tense in a way Elias recognized immediately. Refugees learned to track exits before conversations. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Lyra." "Lyra what?" Another pause. "Lyra Vane." Elias nodded slowly like the name meant nothing to him, though the surname sounded military. Maybe officer family. Maybe not. Hard to tell anymore after the war scattered entire populations across half the galaxy. He poured her a cup of hot tea from the kettle near the oven. "I am not asking for pity," she said suddenly as he set the cup down. "Good," Elias replied. "I do not sell pity. Bread, yes. Pity costs extra." This time the smile actually appeared. Small. Fragile. Gone almost immediately. But it changed her face enough for Elias to notice how young she really looked beneath the exhaustion. The station announcement system crackled again outside. Curfew warnings for undocumented arrivals. Lyra's fingers tightened slightly around the teacup at the sound. Elias noticed. "Security been sweeping this sector again?" he asked. She lowered her eyes. "They are checking refugee permits near the freight tunnels." "You got one." Silence answered him. Elias exhaled slowly through his nose. Figures. Thousands of displaced aliens had flooded the lower station after the border conflicts ended, and Dock District 12 treated paperwork like religion. No permit meant no housing. No food access. No heating credits. Sometimes no oxygen access above the lower decks. The girl looked toward the medal still resting near her elbow. "My mother earned that," she said softly. "Medical Corps 7th Fleet." Elias froze for just a fraction too long before reaching for another tray behind him. 7th Fleet. He remembered hearing that designation years ago over battlefield comms and emergency evacuation frequencies. Human survivors used to whisper about alien medics from the 7th like they were ghosts. "She kept people alive," Lyra continued quietly. "Even human civilians." The oven popped softly behind them as cooling bread settled on the racks. Elias stared into the orange firelight longer than necessary. "Sounds like a good woman," he muttered. Lyra nodded once. "She died during the final evacuation on Kepri Colony." Elias looked down at his scarred hands. Flour still clung white against old burn marks near his knuckles. "War takes the decent ones first," he said. Neither of them spoke after that. Rain hissed against the windows while the bakery filled with the quiet sounds of survival. Hey! Spoon against ceramic. The ticking oven. Two strangers sitting beneath warm light in a station that had almost forgotten what kindness looked like. By midnight the rain had turned heavier, hammering against the station windows hard enough to blur the neon lights outside into streaks of blue and gold. Elias locked the bakery door and flipped the hanging sign from open to closed, but Lyra did not move from her stool near the counter. She held the warm teacup carefully between both hands now, as if the heat itself had become something precious. The color had started returning faintly to her face, though exhaustion still sat heavy behind her violet eyes. Elias walked toward the back storage shelves and returned carrying an old wool blanket folded beneath one arm. "The heating units in the lower shelters barely work," he said while setting it beside her. "You can stay here until the storm eases." Lyra looked genuinely alarmed by the offer. "I cannot impose like that." "You already tracked mud across my clean floor," Elias replied dryly. "Might as well finish the job." She stared at him for a second before lowering her eyes again. Elias could almost see the argument happening inside her. Pride fighting survival. Eventually survival won by a narrow margin. "Only until morning," she whispered. "Sure." He moved around the bakery, shutting down equipment one station at a time. Mixers powered off with soft mechanical clicks. The old refrigeration units hummed low in the background, while the brick oven continued radiating leftover warmth into the room. Lyra watched him quietly as he worked. "You have done this before," she said after a while. "Fed strangers." Elias shrugged without looking at her. "Dock workers forget lunch money. Freight kids run away from home. Old miners spend their heating credits on gambling." He slid baking trays into storage racks with practiced movements. "People get hungry. Most stop seeing hungry people after a while." That made him pause briefly. Outside, a patrol drone floated past the bakery window, its searchlight washing pale white across the glass before drifting onward into the storm. Lyra instinctively lowered her head until the light disappeared. Elias noticed every second of it. "How long you been on the station?" he asked carefully. 3 months. No work permits that whole time. Medical certifications from the outer colonies are not accepted here anymore. Her translator softened slightly on the last words, but Elias still heard the bitterness underneath. "The hospitals say patients would not trust someone from my species after the war." Elias leaned back against the counter silently. Somewhere above them, station pipes groaned under pressure changes, sending vibrations through the ceiling panels. Lyra stared down into the empty soup bowl in front of her. "I used to work in trauma wards," she said quietly. 20-hour shifts. Burn treatment. Lung failures from atmosphere exposure. Children mostly. Her fingers tightened around the teacup again. "Now I cannot even get clearance to sanitize hospital floors." Elias looked toward the faded military medal still sitting near the register. "Funny thing about wars," he muttered. "Everybody says they want heroes until the shooting stops." Lyra gave a tired nod. "Afterward, they only want someone to blame." Silence settled between them again, softer this time. Not awkward, just heavy with things both of them understood too well. Elias grabbed a broom and started sweeping flour from the floor tiles while Lyra watched the movements absently. The bakery lights cast long amber shadows across the room, warm enough to almost make the station outside feel distant. Then a loud burst of laughter echoed from somewhere down Harbor Row. Male voices. Drunk. A bottle shattered outside, followed by rough shouting in human dialect. Lyra stiffened immediately. Elias did not even look up from sweeping. "They are harmless when they are loud," he said calmly. "It is the quiet ones you worry about." To his surprise, that pulled a faint breath of laughter from her. Small and exhausted, but real. Elias glanced over and saw her shoulders relax for the first time all night. For a brief moment, she did not look like a refugee or an outsider or a survivor carrying the last remains of her old life in her coat pocket. She just looked tired, humanly tired, and somehow that hit him harder than anything else. Morning arrived slowly on Harbor Row. The station's artificial sunrise filtered through layers of industrial smog and rain cloud projections, washing the lower district in pale orange light that never quite looked real. Freight sirens echoed through the docking tunnels while exhaust steam drifted between buildings thick enough to hide half the street. Elias had already been working for an hour when the first dock workers shuffled into the bakery, carrying cold air and tired faces with them. Heavy boots thudded across the tile floor. Orders were barked over the hiss of coffee machines and the crackle of warming ovens. Most customers barely looked up from their tablets or ration cards. The station survived by staying too busy to care about strangers. Lyra stayed near the back counter quietly folding napkins beside the soup station. Elias had offered to let her rest longer, but she insisted on helping after sunrise. At first her movements carried the hesitation of someone expecting to be told she did not belong there. By mid-morning, she had already reorganized half the supply shelves more efficiently than Elias ever had. "You alphabetized my spice rack," he muttered while carrying fresh trays from the oven. Lyra glanced over calmly. "You stored cinnamon beside protein salt packets. That is criminal negligence." Elias stared at her for a second before a rough laugh escaped his chest unexpectedly. It felt strange hearing laughter inside the bakery again, the kind that did not sound forced. A group of cargo haulers crowded near the register ordering breakfast sandwiches while rainwater dripped from thick thermal jackets onto the floor. One of them noticed Lyra near the shelves and fell quiet immediately. The others looked over a second later. Human conversations always changed subtly when an alien entered the room. Voices lowered. Shoulders tightened. Eyes lingered too long. Elias noticed it instantly. So did Lyra. The largest dock worker stepped forward slowly. Gray beard. Burn scar across one cheek. Did not know you hired off-worlders now, Carter. His tone stayed casual, but not friendly. Elias wrapped sandwiches in paper without looking up. Did not know my hiring choices required committee approval. A few workers chuckled awkwardly while the older man kept staring toward Lyra. She from the border colonies? She from the back of my bakery, trying to organize my terrible shelves. Elias finally handed over the food bag, which currently makes her more productive than you. More laughter this time. The tension eased slightly. Dock workers respected sarcasm more than speeches. The older man grunted and took his order before leaving with the others. Still, Elias noticed the extra glances aimed toward Lyra as the group disappeared outside into the station crowds. Lyra kept folding napkins for several seconds after the door closed. You did not have to defend me, she said quietly. Elias shrugged while wiping down the counter. People around here bark more than they bite. Not always. That answer carried enough weight to silence him briefly. He studied her face more carefully then. The exhaustion remained, but there were older things behind it too. The kind nobody picked up from a single bad week. Before he could respond, the bakery door slid open again with a sharp hydraulic hiss. A station courier stepped inside, holding a data slate beneath one arm. Young, nervous. Package delivery for Elias Carter, he announced over the lunch rush noise. Elias frowned and signed the screen with flour-covered fingers before taking the small metal container. No return address. No shipping seal. Just an old military insignia burned faintly into the lid. His chest tightened immediately. He recognized the symbol before his brain wanted to admit it. 7th Fleet Medical Division. Lyra saw the insignia too. Her hands froze completely. For a second, the noise of the bakery seemed to disappear beneath the distant hum of the station outside. Elias opened the container slowly. Inside rested a single folded photograph protected beneath cracked plastic film. The image showed a younger Elias sitting on the floor of a battlefield evacuation tent nearly 20 years earlier. His right shoulder wrapped in bandages. Exhausted. Bloody. Alive. Beside him knelt an alien medic with silver hair and tired violet eyes. Lyra stopped breathing. Elias stared silently at the photograph while old memories crashed through him harder than the station storms outside ever could. At the bottom corner, someone had written a message by hand, in faded ink barely visible beneath time and scratches. To the stubborn human who refused to die, stay kind. The lunch crowd faded slowly after noon, leaving behind the familiar smells of coffee grounds, warm bread, and damp station jackets drying near the heaters. Outside the bakery windows, Harbor Row buzzed with the usual machinery of survival. Cargo lifts screeched overhead. Vendors shouted discount prices through static-filled speakers. Somewhere down the block, a repair drone sparked loudly while welding damaged pipework above the transit lane. But inside the bakery, everything felt quieter now. Elias stood near the counter staring at the old photograph like he was afraid to blink and lose it. The younger version of himself inside the image barely looked familiar anymore. No gray in his hair. No bakery apron. Just a tired soldier sitting beneath harsh emergency lights while an alien medic worked beside him with calm hands and exhausted eyes. Lyra moved closer slowly, her expression unreadable. That is my mother, she whispered. Elias swallowed once before nodding. Yeah. His voice came out rougher than expected. He carefully placed the photograph back inside the container like it weighed more than metal and paper should. Her name was Sarah Vane. Lyra stared at him in surprise. You remember her name? Elias let out a faint breath through his nose. Hard to forget somebody who saves your life while the ceiling is collapsing around both of you. He leaned against the counter, eyes distant now. Kepri Colony. Last year of the war. Human Command pulled out early after the reactor failures started. The station around him seemed to fade as old memories resurfaced beneath the smell of bread and coffee. Most medics evacuated with the first civilian transports. His gaze lowered toward the photograph again. Your mother stayed. Lyra listened without moving. Even the bakery noises seemed softer now, as though the room itself understood this. Conversation mattered. Elias rubbed absent-mindedly at the old scar beneath his shirt sleeve. I got hit during an evacuation run near the south docking tunnels. Thought I was done for. He gave a tired half-smile. Then this alien medic started yelling at me because I kept apologizing for bleeding on her equipment. To his surprise, Lyra laughed softly. It sounded painfully familiar. The same warm undertone from the woman in the photograph. Elias noticed immediately. So did she. Her smile faded a second later beneath something sadder. She used to say humor kept people breathing longer, Lyra murmured. Elias nodded slowly. Sounds about right. Silence settled between them again, but this time it felt full instead of empty. Shared. Outside, rainwater dripped rhythmically from the transit rails onto the street below, while station lights flickered against puddles like broken stars. Lyra finally looked down at the military medal resting near the register. She carried that medal every day, she said quietly, even after the war ended. Her fingers brushed the edge carefully. When the refugee ships left Kepri, she gave it to me. Elias frowned slightly. Why? Lyra stared at the medal for several seconds before answering. Because she knew she was not getting on the shuttle. The words landed softly but hit harder than shouting ever could. Elias looked away toward the oven fire glowing low behind the brickwork. She stayed behind for the wounded, Lyra continued. Human and alien both. Her voice remained steady somehow. The last message she sent me said that fear was contagious. But kindness was too. Elias closed his eyes briefly. For years, he had carried fragmented memories from that evacuation. Smoke-filled hallways. Emergency alarms. The sharp smell of antiseptic and melted wiring. A medic with silver hair forcing exhausted soldiers to keep moving even while half the station burned around them. Back then he never learned what happened to her afterward. He had assumed the war swallowed her like it swallowed everyone else. Lyra looked around the bakery quietly. This place smells like her field kitchen, she said unexpectedly. Elias blinked. Your mother? Baked. Terribly. That pulled another rough laugh from him. Then she would fit in here perfectly. Lyra smiled again, but tears quietly gathered along the edges of her violet eyes despite her efforts to hide them. Elias pretended not to notice. Instead, he walked toward the bread rack and sliced another loaf while the old station heaters hummed softly around them. Because sometimes the kindest thing a person could do was allow grief to breathe without forcing it into words. The evening rush hit Harbor Row just as another cold front rolled across the station exterior. Wind screamed faintly through the ventilation shafts overhead, while sheets of freezing rain rattled against the bakery windows hard enough to shake the glass. Inside, the ovens burned bright orange against the darkening room, filling the air with heat and the rich smell of rising dough. Elias moved steadily between counters, serving soup bowls and coffee mugs to exhausted workers coming off the freight docks. Lyra stayed beside the preparation table, shaping bread rolls with careful hands while trying not to draw attention to herself. It almost worked. Almost. The trouble started when a young loader from Dock 17 walked in carrying a crate scanner beneath one arm. He froze immediately after spotting the silver medal resting near the register. Wait, he muttered, stepping closer. I know that insignia. Conversations around the bakery quieted slightly. Not fully, just enough for people to start listening. Elias kept slicing bread without looking up. Then congratulations on surviving basic history classes. The young man ignored the joke. His eyes shifted toward Lyra. That is 7th Fleet Medical Corps. One of the older dock workers near the soup counter frowned. Alien war medics? Another customer turned on his stool to look toward Lyra more openly now. The atmosphere changed slowly after that, like temperature dropping before a storm. Nobody shouted. Nobody threatened her. Somehow that made it worse. Harbor Row had mastered the art of silent judgment years ago. Lyra lowered her eyes toward the dough beneath her hands while the bakery suddenly felt too small around her. Elias noticed the exact moment her shoulders tightened again. People eat slower when they stare, he said flatly, while sliding another tray into the oven. A few customers looked embarrassed enough to glance away, but not all of them. The older dock worker stepped closer to the register. My brother died during the Kepri evacuations. His tone stayed controlled, but grief lived underneath every word. A lot of humans did. Lyra swallowed quietly before answering. A lot of my people died too. The room fell silent after that. Only the soft mechanical hum of the bakery heaters and the ticking oven filled the space between them. Elias leaned against the counter slowly, flour dust still covering his scarred hands. You know what I remember about Kepri? He asked. Nobody answered. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the station hall. I remember civilians packed into medical tents so tight nobody could breathe properly. He glanced toward Lyra briefly. I remember alien doctors treating human children while the evacuation alarms kept sounding overhead. The older dock worker frowned slightly. Elias continued before anyone could interrupt. War turns everybody into numbers eventually. Dead counts. Supply counts. Refugee counts. His eyes drifted toward the metal near the register. But the people trying to keep others alive during all that chaos? Those were not enemies. The young loader shifted uncomfortably. Still does not change what happened. No, Elias agreed quietly. Nothing changes what happened. He looked around the bakery slowly then. But hunger is not justice. Freezing people out is not healing. Lyra stood completely still beside the prep table, violet eyes fixed downward while the room absorbed his words. One customer near the back finally spoke up. A tired woman wearing maintenance coveralls stained with engine grease. My daughter was treated by 7th Fleet medics on Kepri, she said softly. Several heads turned toward her. Alien doctor stayed with her until the evacuation shuttle arrived. She glanced toward Lyra. Kid still talks about her sometimes. The tension inside the bakery loosened just slightly after that. Not gone, but cracked open enough for humanity to slip back through. The older dock worker let out a long breath before taking his soup tray toward a corner table without another word. Conversations slowly resumed afterward, quieter now, more thoughtful. Lyra kept shaping dough silently beside the counter while Elias returned to the ovens. But after several minutes passed, one of the customers approached the register before leaving. Without speaking, he placed 2 extra heating credits beside the tip jar. Then another customer did the same. And another. Elias noticed Lyra staring at the small pile growing beside the register with visible confusion. He simply shrugged while sliding fresh bread onto the cooling rack. People around here are stubborn, he muttered. Sometimes it just takes them a while to remember they still have hearts. 3 days later, the bakery no longer felt like a place Lyra was hiding in. It felt lived in again. The shelves stayed organized. Fresh soup simmered before sunrise. The front windows no longer carried fingerprints because Lyra cleaned them every morning before the dockworkers arrived. Even the old station regulars had started greeting her with cautious nods instead of uncomfortable silence. Harbor Row still looked worn down by too many hard years, but something subtle had shifted inside the little bakery with the warm lights and cracked floor tiles. People lingered longer now. They talked more quietly. Sometimes they laughed again. Elias noticed all of it without mentioning a word. Early that evening, freezing rain drifted across the station exterior in silver sheets, while cargo alarms echoed faintly from the upper docks. Lyra stood near the prep counter rolling dough beneath soft oven light, while Elias repaired a broken heating vent near the back wall. The old machine rattled loudly every few minutes like it was threatening retirement. Hit it harder, Lyra suggested calmly without looking up from the dough. Elias frowned at the vent. That is already my entire repair strategy. Explains a lot about this place. He snorted despite himself and tightened another loose bolt. For a few seconds the bakery felt almost peaceful. Then the front door slid open sharply enough to let cold air rush across the room. 2 station security officers stepped inside wearing dark gray patrol coats streaked with rainwater. Conversations from the nearby tables stopped immediately. Elias straightened slowly from the heating vent while Lyra froze beside the prep station. The older officer scanned the room once before focusing directly on her. Lyra Vane. Her hands tightened against the counter. Yes. The younger officer activated a data pad. Your refugee identification has been flagged during regional verification updates. Elias already disliked the phrase before the man even finished speaking. Flagged for what? He asked flatly. The older officer kept his eyes on Lyra. Expired medical transfer credentials. Unregistered employment activity. Failure to report temporary residence. Several customers shifted uncomfortably near the front tables. Outside, thunder rolled faintly through the station hall. Lyra lowered her gaze. I understand. Elias stepped forward immediately. She works here because I asked her to. That does not change station policy. The younger officer sounded bored more than cruel, which somehow made it worse. Unregistered refugees are required to report for relocation processing. The word relocation landed heavily inside the bakery. Everyone in Harbor Row knew what it really meant. Temporary camps near the lower maintenance sectors. Crowded shelters. Food ration lines. Months of disappearing into administrative systems that forgot people existed. Elias wiped flour slowly from his hands while staring at the officers. She is not causing trouble. Sir, this is not personal. The older officer finally softened slightly. But regulations are regulations. Lyra carefully removed her apron and folded it beside the counter. Every movement looked painfully calm. Controlled. like someone preparing to lose another home without making the process harder for others. I will go with you, she said quietly. Something about those words hit Elias harder than shouting ever could. No anger. No begging. Just exhaustion. The younger officer stepped toward the counter with a restraint scanner ready for transport registration. Then one of the dock workers near the window suddenly stood up. The older man with the burn scar across his cheek. Hold on, he muttered. Everyone turned toward him. He reached into his jacket pocket and dropped a worn identification chip onto the counter. Transfer 1 month of my heating credits to her residency account. Silence filled the bakery instantly. Then the maintenance woman from earlier stood too. Add mine. Another worker near the soup station pulled out his station card. Mine too. The younger officer blinked in visible confusion as more customers slowly rose from their seats. Freight handlers, welders, transit mechanics, people who barely had enough credits for themselves. One after another, they placed station cards, heating chips, meal vouchers, and temporary residency transfers onto the counter beside the old metal. Elias watched quietly while the pile grew larger. Lyra stared at the customers in complete disbelief. The older dock worker rubbed awkwardly at his beard before speaking toward her without quite meeting her eyes. Your mother helped people during the war, he muttered. Seems fair somebody helps her daughter now. Outside, the storm continued hammering Harbor Row beneath cold station lights. But inside the bakery, something warmer than heat spread silently through the room. The security officers left the bakery nearly 20 minutes later carrying fewer arguments than when they arrived. Harbor Row residents had flooded the registration forms with enough temporary housing credits and employment sponsorships to force the station system into approving a probationary residency permit for Lyra. It was messy, bureaucratic, probably irritating for everyone involved, which meant the lower station had handled it perfectly. The moment the officers disappeared back into the freezing rain outside, the tension inside the bakery released all at once. Conversations returned slowly. Someone laughed nervously near the soup station. A freight mechanic muttered that paperwork was more dangerous than pirates. Even Elias finally exhaled the breath he had been holding. Lyra remained standing near the counter staring at the stack of donated credits and transfer cards. Beside the metal, her expression looked almost lost. Why would they do that? She asked softly. Elias wiped his hands on his apron before answering. Because decent people get tired of watching the universe act ugly all the time. She looked toward the customers still finishing their meals beneath the warm bakery lights. The older dock worker lifted his coffee cup awkwardly in her direction before pretending to focus on the weather report playing silently across the overhead monitor. Lyra's eyes shimmered faintly beneath the amber light. She blinked hard once and looked away before anyone noticed. The storm outside worsened as evening settled deeper across the station. Rain hammered against Harbor Row hard enough to rattle the storefront signs, while cold wind screamed through the transit tunnels overhead. Most customers eventually shuffled home toward overcrowded apartments and maintenance bunks, leaving the bakery warm and quiet once again. Elias locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed while Lyra cleaned tables near the windows. You missed a spot, he muttered, pointing toward a perfectly clean corner. Lyra narrowed her eyes slightly. You are impossible. That is what keeps the bread fluffy. To his surprise, she laughed fully this time. Warm. Genuine. The sound lingered inside the bakery longer than either of them expected. Later that night, Elias carried 2 bowls of leftover soup toward the front counter, while Lyra sat studying the old photograph again beneath the dim lights. Rainwater streaked slowly down the windows behind her, turning the neon reflections outside into rivers of blue and gold. She looked happy there, Lyra whispered while holding the image carefully. Elias sat across from her with a tired groan as his knees protested the movement. Your mother yelled at me for 30 straight minutes after that picture was taken. Lyra blinked. Why? Apparently removing your own bandages with a utility knife counts as medically irresponsible. A faint smile touched her lips. Yes, that sounds like her. Silence settled comfortably after that, the kind that no longer needed caution around it. Elias dipped bread into his soup while studying the bakery around him. The old place still looked worn down. Ceiling paint peeling near the vents. Tables scratched by years of station traffic. Ovens older than some planet-side governments. But tonight it felt fuller somehow. Warmer. Like life had quietly returned while nobody was paying attention. Lyra eventually looked toward him across the counter. You know, she said softly, my mother used to believe humans were terrifying. Elias snorted into his soup. Smart woman. No, her violet eyes lifted toward his. She believed humans frightened her because they felt everything too deeply. The bakery heaters hummed softly around them. Your anger, your grief, your loyalty. She glanced toward the front windows where rain blurred the station lights outside. She said humans carried kindness the same way stars carried fire. Recklessly, Elias stared down at the steam rising from his soup bowl for several seconds before shaking his head faintly. Your mother clearly never watched me burn 3 batches of cinnamon rolls in one morning. Lyra smiled again, smaller this time. Sadder too. Maybe kindness was never about perfection. Outside, the storm continued raging through Harbor Row beneath endless industrial lights and cargo traffic. But inside the little bakery on Dock District 12, 2 survivors sat beneath warm ovens, sharing soup and old memories while the universe, for one quiet night, finally stopped feeling quite so cold. Winter settled over Dock District 12 2 weeks later with freezing rain, overloaded heating grids, and the familiar smell of engine smoke drifting through the lower station corridors. Harbor Row remained crowded as always, packed with exhausted workers chasing overtime shifts and refugees trying to disappear into the machinery of station life. But the bakery had changed. People noticed it the moment they walked through the doors. The old place still carried cracked floor tiles and crooked shelves, but now warm lights spilled across the windows before sunrise every morning. Fresh soup simmered by noon. Bread sold out before evening most days. And near the register, mounted carefully inside a small glass frame above the tip jar, hung a worn silver medal from the 7th Fleet Medical Corps. Nobody touched it. Nobody joked about it. Somehow, even the roughest dock workers understood certain things deserved respect. Elias stood behind the counter before Dawn shaping dough while old jazz music crackled softly from the bakery radio. Across from him, Lyra adjusted inventory numbers on a faded data pad with the same serious concentration she once used organizing refugee medical records. Outside, freight trains roared through the transit tunnels overhead, shaking flour dust loose from the ceiling beams. You counted the cinnamon rolls twice, Elias muttered without looking up. Lyra frowned at the screen. That is because you keep giving them away for free. That is called marketing. That is called terrible business management. He grinned faintly. And yet somehow we are still open. The front door chimed softly then. A small human child stepped inside wearing a station school uniform 2 sizes too large, cheeks pink from the cold. He approached the counter nervously while clutching a few heating credits in his hand. Mr. Carter? Elias glanced up. Morning, Tyler. The boy looked toward Lyra uncertainly before speaking again. My mom said to bring this. He placed a folded paper bag carefully on the counter. Inside rested several fresh thermal bandages and medical packets scavenged from upper station clinics. Lyra blinked in surprise. Your mother works maintenance near Dock 9, right? The boy nodded proudly. She said medics should have supplies. Before either of them could answer, the child hurried back outside into the freezing rain. Elias watched the door slide shut behind him before quietly returning to the dough. Lyra stared at the medical supplies for several long seconds. People keep doing that, she whispered. Yeah. Elias kneaded flour into the countertop slowly. Turns out kindness spreads faster than rumors around here. The station lights flickered once overhead before stabilizing again. Somewhere outside, morning sirens announced incoming cargo arrivals from the outer colonies. Harbor Row slowly came alive beyond the bakery windows beneath neon reflections and drifting steam. Clouds. Lyra carefully placed the thermal bandages beside the register beneath her mother's medal. Her fingers lingered against the glass frame afterward. I used to think survival meant holding on to whatever you had left, she admitted quietly. Food. Credits. Memories. Elias slid another tray toward the oven fire. And now, Lyra looked toward the crowded station beyond the windows where tired strangers hurried through the cold carrying coffee cups and toolkits and grocery bags through another difficult day. Now I think maybe survival is when people refuse to let each other disappear. Elias did not answer immediately. He simply opened the old brick oven, letting warm orange light spill across the bakery walls. Customers would arrive soon. Workers with frozen hands. Families low on credits. People carrying private griefs through loud station hallways. Same as every morning. But now there would also be fresh bread waiting for them. Warm soup. A clean table beneath steady lights. A place where nobody had to trade dignity for survival. Elias glanced toward the framed metal above the register one final time before the morning rush began. Then he reached up quietly and adjusted it straighter against the wall. Not like a war trophy, not like a relic, more like a promise. Outside, the station thundered endlessly beneath cold steel skies and cargo traffic stretching toward distant stars. But inside the little bakery on Harbor Row, warmth still existed. And for the first time in years, that felt enough.